Welcome to Screens of the Stone Age, the podcast where scientists review movies about prehistoric people. My name is Josh Lindell. I'm a grad student studying Neanderthal teeth, and I'm here with...
I'm Dr. Ross Barnett, worker in ancient DNA, looking mainly at the phylogenetics of cats.
And I'm Kyle. I am one half of the History According to Hollywood podcast. I am an unemployed historian with a master's degree, and I'm really happy to be here today.
So typical historian with a master's degree, right?
Yep, it's doctored or bust.
Thanks for joining us and apparently filling in for Kim. Kim was supposed to be here, but we're not sure where she is, so maybe she'll pop in halfway through this recording. It's a good thing we have a historian joining us today, because today we're reviewing the movie National Treasure from 2004. This is the farthest we've strayed from our Stone Age topic, and probably wouldn't have bothered doing this one, except that this was a request from Temperance, who says this is one of the favorite movies of her and her family. So hopefully we have good things to say about it.
And thank you, Temperance, for giving me a reason to be on this podcast.
But yeah, so we don't have any Stone Age. We don't have a whole lot of archaeology really to talk about. So I guess this is going to be a lesson in American history for Canadian and Scott and... Ross, I don't know how much you know about American history. We probably get a lot of it like by osmosis through popular culture, like this movie, I guess. But
the sort of saying is, if America sneezes, Britain catches a cold.
Yeah, you do.
Yeah, we've got a big old COVID coming our way. Has to be said.
Yeah, well, we tried. I did my best, Ross.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, we can't ask anything more.
Look, I stood at the 2-hour pull line. Leave me alone.
Yeah, no judgment.
All right, Kyle, can I ask you to summarize this movie in case our listeners haven't seen it?
Oh, yeah, I will do my absolute best. This movie is an interesting one to summarize. Full disclosure, if I get to the end of this and you're confused, just watch the movie. That's the only medicine to that disease I can give you. But here we go. So we open on a spooky house somewhere in the United States, probably the Northeast. Most historical movies happen in the Northeast because that's the only part of American history that anybody ever wants to study. A boy who is later revealed to be Benjamin Franklin Gates is roaming his grandfather's attic when he finds just some fun artifacts and historical things. His grouchy and nonplussed grandfather describes to him that the Gates family's entire role in history has been trying to find this Templar Knight's treasure that has disappeared at some point during the centuries since its gathering, when they, in a very nice Americanized version in the movie, pillaged the Holy Land in the in the Middle East to get this treasure, and in true Hollywood Templar fashion, ignored any politicization of the Templar Order and were like, they were good men on a mission to save the treasure from bad men, and that's the info that you're armed with for the rest of this movie. He describes that the trail goes cold somewhere in the 1800s when Charles Carroll, I think I have this order right, where Charles Carroll, the last surviving signer of the Declaration of Independence, which is a true historical fact, so that was fun, is dying, and he's on his way to see President Andrew Jackson to tell him the final hint, or the starting hint, however you want to look at it, as to where to find this treasure. In classic movie plotline, the president's just randomly unavailable in the middle of this stormy night because people went places in storms in the 1830s, and Charles Carroll ceremoniously dies at the age of 95, I believe, in this carriage, but not until he whispers to his driver something about this woman named Charlotte. Specifically, the secret lies with Charlotte. And then that's it. For the next 150 years, that's what the Gates family has to go off of. Benjamin's father comes up and is like, hey, crazy old man, stop telling my son to go search for this treasure. You've done it. Your dad did it. I did it. We're all broke. We're all sad. It never works. And the grandfather's like, blah, 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 grandpa. And so Benjamin Gates in true kid fashion, says, I'm not going to listen to my dad. And we fast forward to where Nicolas Cage is now Benjamin Gates in the middle of the Arctic Circle looking for this ship, the Charlotte, with Sean Bean, who, spoiler alert, does not die in this movie. So go, Sean, go. We find the Charlotte hidden in the ice with the help of Riley, this tech genius guru and resident comedian of the movie. He's the comic relief a lot.
Quote unquote comedian.
Yeah. Comic relief is a really strong term, but that's his role. Grouchy, sarcastic millennial is really more of what Riley is. So they find the Charlotte hidden under the ice. And while they're looking for the treasure, they only find barrels of gunpowder. However, Benjamin Gates is not going to be dissuaded by the fact that his entire life's work is crumbling before his eyes. And he finds the captain guarding this random barrel, or the body of the captain, I should say, the frozen corpse of this poor guy, and peels from his frozen fingers this pipe, which in the engravings on it reveals a phrase, which I'm not going to try to repeat because it doesn't make any sense outside the context of the movie. But long story short, it's a riddle that indicates that there is some sort of hint or map hidden on the back of the Declaration of Independence. Let that sink in for a second. Okay, now that you've all accepted that that's a thing that we're rolling with in this movie, they brainstorm briefly how they can get their hands on the Declaration of Independence, and the short answer is they're not, because there's no way that that's ever a thing that anybody's going to let them do. You can't run chemical tests on a 250-year-old document. And his friend, compatriot, coworker, fund guru, Sean Bean's character, Ian, says, well, we'll just steal it. I used to be a Black Ops agent. That's vague enough. I'm not going to describe it anymore. And we can just steal it. And Benjamin says no. And Ian says, okay, well, I'm going to steal it, and I'm going to leave you to die in this ship. They light the gunpowder on fire. They leave. Benjamin and Riley use their situational awareness, I suppose, to hide in a separate area of the ship. And even though footage shows the entire ship blow up, these two crawl out and start walking 9 miles in the Arctic to the next Inuit village. Fast forward to a reality where they didn't freeze to death, fall through the ice, or get eaten by a polar bear, and suddenly we're back in the United States. Okay? I'm saying this with a lot of sarcasm. I like this movie. This is just the only way that I can summarize it for you guys to make it feel like it feels when you watch it. You suspend a lot of disbelief, get a little tipsy, be ready for a good time. We get back to the United States, and we try to figure out how to convince a law enforcement agency to help us stop Sean Bean from stealing the Declaration of Independence. No one listens because the Declaration of Independence has been analyzed for centuries and nobody's ever seen a map on the back of it. So Benjamin Gates comes up with the brilliant idea, I'll steal it before he can. And that makes me the good guy. I will steal the Declaration to protect it from the bad guy. And in the middle of this, Diane Kruger appears as a National Archives agent, and is intrigued but not convinced by this idea of this crazy guy and his map on the back of a important United States national document. She dismisses him. He realizes she needs a button or something. There's weird historian flirting that happens in this meeting, as only historians can. We're a very niche group of people, but man, you offer me a George Washington campaign button, and it's going to get you some Kobe beef or something. So Benjamin and Riley realize that during the gala for the National Archives, the Declaration of Independence is going to be in a less guarded area dedicated to preservation. Through a lot of Hollywood mumbo jumbo and searching wires and finding fingerprints and things, they manifest their way into the gala, where Benjamin Gates finds Diane Kruger's character at this gala. Shocker. I know, right? The pretty blonde girl comes back for a second time in the movie. Whoa. And Benjamin offers her a champagne glass, gives her this lecture about how they're celebrating treason because what the founding fathers were doing was treason. And then he pounds 2 champagne glasses, takes hers, and leaves, revealing that he's taking her fingerprints off of the champagne glass. He circumnavigates the biometric problems and the passcode to the preservation room. We're not, there's no reservation but below the National Archives, guys. That's some deep conspiracy theory, I guess. But preservation room, where he starts to unload the Declaration from its protective cover. Suddenly, Ian and his Black Ops team arrive in the National Archives, circumnavigating security in the old-fashioned way, which is blowing up a fan because nobody would hear that, and scurrying through the 6-foot tall air ducts that obviously exist in all old buildings, and tasing a guard to use him to get through the biometrics. And we encounter each other again in the hallway in front of the elevator, where Benjamin Gates uses the Declaration of Independence's cover to block bullets being shot at him. He falls into the elevator. He runs away. Ian's crew chases him. Diane Kruger appears randomly, angry that he's still in the Declaration of Independence. She gets abducted. A short car chase ensues where somehow Benjamin Gates and Riley, with no training and no guns, rescue Diane Kruger and the Declaration of Independence from the men with the training and the guns. Because that's how Hollywood works. So we run away to Benjamin's father's house, where through a bunch of science that seems real, but is probably not, but could be, we realize that there is indeed instructions on the back of the Declaration of Independence, and in the form of another riddle. At some point, we've also discovered that the Freemasons are related to this treasure. The link in the movie is not super clear, but we went from Templars to Freemasons to Benjamin Gates's father's living room with the Declaration of Independence. We realize that it is indicating the Silence Do-Good letters, which is something that Benjamin Franklin wrote under an alias when he was a teenager. And Benjamin's father says, yeah, I used to have those letters, but I donated them to a museum. So we go to that museum. Riley pays a kid to take certain letters from the Silence Do-Good letters to make a message. He realizes that it's at the house of Pass and Stowe is the next clue. It's the Liberty Bell. It's revealed that it's related to the Liberty Bell. They go to Independence Hall, where Benjamin finds really old code reader glasses that Benjamin Franklin apparently designed. Puts them on the back of the Declaration of Independence and finds here at the wall is the next phrase, but here, Heere at the wall. A bunch of historian big brain thought later, he realizes that means Wall Street, but not until he runs through the streets of Philadelphia, because that's where Independence Hall is, if I'm remembering my history correctly, avoiding guns and henchmen, while Riley and Diane Kruger's character, Abigail, also do the same thing. The problem is Riley and Abigail are slightly less good at it than Benjamin is. He escapes with both the glasses and the fake Declaration of Independence empty carrier. They escape with their lives. Ian has the Declaration of Independence. And then Benjamin Gates gets picked up by the FBI, who have been trailing him ever since he brazenly stole this document of incredible national importance. The weirdly charismatic, calm lead detective on the case basically says, well, you have two options. You either help me and go to jail for forever, or you don't help me and you go to jail for forever. Somebody's got to go to jail. Benjamin Gates says, okay, well, I guess I'd rather help you than go to jail forever. They set up a sting operation to catch Ian, but plot twist, Abigail and Riley have been working with Ian to get Benjamin out of jail. He jumps off of a United States naval aircraft carrier, which, for the record, is a long way to the ocean, and he probably would have died. But because it's a movie, he survives with no deep dive training. He tandem breathes with one of Ian's associates all the way back to shore, where he meets Ian, and he figures out that the deal was Ian would get him out of federal custody, but if there is a treasure, Ian gets all of it. A big moral blow for our heroes. And as an insurance policy, Ian has also kidnapped Benjamin Gates' father, because that's what bad guys do. Here at the wall is Wall Street and an old street called Here. He gives a historical lecture about how the Dutch used to own that area in New York, and he's right. It's not super duper relevant to the plot. It's just a fun historical tidbit they throw in there. And somehow we end up in a church, a Trinity church, I believe. And I'll have to double check that. There's a lot of places going around.
Yeah, it's Trinity Church in New York.
Trinity Church, yeah. They end up in Trinity Church in New York, where they find, after defacing a grave of a Freemason and an important man, they find a secret underground passage. Da, da, da. The passage is long, winding, perilous. Ian's main henchman falls to his death. Abigail, Riley, and Benjamin almost all fall to their deaths. But somehow, the rest of us survive on this 300-year-old crank elevator made of rope and, I don't know, faith, trust, and pixie dust, apparently. And we finally find a dead end lit by a single lantern. Ian, understandably steamed after losing one of his best friends and spending what I'm assuming is millions of dollars and committing a lot of felonies in the pursuit of this treasure, is told by Benjamin and his father that the one lantern points to the Old North Church in Boston because they purposefully misquote the one if by land, two if by sea story and say that the British came by land. They did not. They came by sea. But Ian, not knowing, believes them and leaves them to die in this passage. After a lot of heart-to-hearts and moral reckonings with, the treasure must have been real. There was a room for it, even if it's gone now. Benjamin and his father find out that there has to be a secondary air shaft because that's how mines work. So that's a good fun thing. They open it and bada bing, bada boom, the Templar treasure hidden underneath the Trinity Church itself. They crawl out. Benjamin meets the federal agent, offers him the treasure, and says, hey, I know somebody has to go to jail, but I can make it the bad guy if you have a helicopter. We send Ian to jail. It's revealed that Benjamin has forfeited almost all of the 10% finder's fee, which is ridiculous given the size of the treasure. And the 1% that he has decided to take for all of them is still enough to buy a massive estate for him and his new girlfriend, Abigail, and a Ferrari for Riley that he cannot drive. And ladies and gentlemen, that is the Cliff Notes version of National Treasure. Pause for applause.
Yeah, so I have to say, after watching this, it's a good movie. It's like tight. It's like I'm looking for plot holes, and I keep thinking, oh, I got a plot hole. Then the movie's like, nope, that's not a plot hole. That's actually well written. So I'm like, okay, great movie. I don't really care that much for action movies, so I was like constantly zoning out, and I'm trying to figure out what's happening, and it's a treasure hunt, so I always have to go back and why are they doing this? And then like, oh, it all checks out. Like this everything makes sense, but there's a lot of little technical historical details, and I really needed a lot more time to research all these. But from what I can tell, and I'm a little worried that this is because I am a prehistorian and this is not my area of expertise, it seemed like a lot of the stuff they say is pretty accurate. So maybe we can go through like little details and point out any of the historical accuracies that there are in it, or just like scientific, or just like general like logical inaccuracies, because there's a few of those.
Yeah.
So what do you have to start with? What is the most glaring? What are the most glaring inaccuracies?
So the crazy part is, like you said, there's not a lot of massive historical inaccuracies if you take them each independently. So most of the facts that they use are pretty right. So like Benjamin Franklin, for example, did write letters under the name Silence Dogwood. Here at the Wall, there was a Here Street. It is where Wall Street is now when the Dutch owned or controlled New York. It's less of there's glaring historical inaccuracies, and it's more of you have to work under the assumption that the men who helped found the United States of America were in possession of a massive amount of treasure and were putting clues in their own history to reveal the hiding place of this treasure. Which the crazy thing is, like, there are hidden treasures throughout history. Some of them have been found. Many of them have been not. Some of them even do seem to have some weird clues. But for the most part, treasures are lost because people quit telling people where they are, not because they can't figure out the clues. And the Masons, the Freemasons that they reference a lot, still exist to this day. So if that treasure does exist, somebody knows where it's at. They won't ever tell anybody. But if somehow the Templars had a treasure and it came under the supervision of Freemasonry, somebody knows where that is. Because as the kid of a guy who belonged to the Scottish Rite of the Masons, those guys have secrets. I don't think they have a secret that involves a $100 billion golden treasure hidden under Trinity Church, but they have secrets, and they're the oldest fraternity, or one of them, in human history. So really, the answer to the question is you find a high-ranking Freemason in this movie, and you go, hey, dude, this bad guy's going to steal your treasure. And he goes, oh, okay, well, I'll just go move it. And then boom. That's probably the end of it. Some of the coolest historical tidbits, though, for sure, are The use of Charles Carroll as the oldest signer of the Declaration of Independence, because he was. We have absolutely no proof that he was hiding the secret of a massive treasure, but he was the only Catholic who signed the Declaration of Independence, which in 1776, it's a big deal that a largely Protestant group of men would even allow a Catholic to sign an important document because that is just how rough religious tension was back in the day. Um, the use of the silence dog Dogwood. Let me double
Do
check
good.
my do good. Yeah, the use of the silence do good letters also very cool because once again, silence do good was indeed an alias used by Benjamin Franklin to get his work published in the New England Current.
When he was 16 years old, it was his brother's paper, and
Mm-hmm.
he was 16 years old and he wanted to write, and his brother wouldn't let him. So he wrote them under a fake name pretending to be an old widow, right?
Yep, pretty much. Yeah, that guy. There could be a movie about Benjamin Franklin's like side hustles. The man was everywhere.
Are there any movies about Benjamin Franklin?
Not that I know of, and not any good ones. He's an interesting historical character because he plays this really big role in the social memory of the American Revolution. But by the time the revolution actually starts, the guy is like 80, I think. He's elderly. And it's not that he's not important, but he's important in the generation of people before the founding fathers. So we consider him a founding father, but he is important in the 1750s, 1740s, and he's one of the first people to argue that the colonies should work together, that they under English rule they should kind of coalesce into one big colony to give themselves a little more punching power in British politics. So he's one of the leaders of anytime there's a crisis, he's like, we need to unite. We're weak. There's only 13 of us and we're small. But if we stand together, then we have a better chance of staving off the Iroquois Confederacy, the French, um, British political machinations against our own English selves, whatever it is. So he's very important, but this American thing that we've done where we've kind of sold him as continuing to be an integral part of our own independence, that's a mixed bag of truth. He was there, he was important. He was not at the time of the Revolutionary War a driving factor anymore in the quest simply because he is 70 years old when the war starts. And so he's relevant. He's very much still there. He's important in securing French aid for the revolution. So he's important in a way that we don't usually give him credit for. So he is in France for pretty much the entire war, arguing in the court of Louis the 16th, hey, you hate England, right? Well, we don't like them anymore. We'd like to be independent, and the more money you give us, the more of their soldiers we can kill, and the less of them you have to fight later. And finally, Louis goes, yeah, okay, I like that plan. So, yeah, like I said, there's a lot of fun historical tidbits in here, and it's not a movie where I get to have fun picking the facts apart. It's a movie where I get to have fun watching how they put the facts together. The only thing that I can't find is I don't think there was ever a ship called the Charlotte lost in the Arctic, and so I think that that's the thing where they had to fabricate the stepping stone to make the rest of it work. But that's how Hollywood works. Like you almost always have to create a fake fact in order to make the rest of them fall together.
Well, then let me tell you, the Charlotte in the movie was based probably on a real ship, at least according to Wikipedia and a few other sources, because there was an English merchant ship called the Charlotte, which now this is the part I don't understand how this pipe got onto this particular ship, because this ship was chartered to carry convicts to Australia.
And why is it in the Arctic if it's carrying convicts to Australia?
Well, it was probably lost off the coast of Newfoundland in 1818. So
Okay. All right. Never mind. Maybe the other impressive part of this movie is it was made in 2004. So this is before, it's not before historical research, obviously, but this is before directors and producers and screenwriters could kind of type into Google and ask questions so that they knew going ahead of time. So the amount of research that went into making this script today would be insane. So in an era where you're still to find these fun details combing through hundreds of pages of physical archival work is pretty impressive. Like somebody got paid, I'm hoping good money to do a lot of work into making a plausible screenplay for this movie.
Yeah, definitely a movie where they must have had a real historical consultant.
Yeah.
In contrast to, 10,000 BC, which we reviewed on your podcast, where the historical consultant was Graham Hancock's Fingerprints of the Gods.
Yeah, or the historical consultant was Atlantis. But yeah, it's an incredibly impressive concept, and I like the idea that there is more to events than there seems to be, because often in history there are. So again, I'm never, ever, ever, ever going to claim that there's a Templar treasure held by the Freemasons, because I have there's probably not. And if there is, good for them. They've never let it slip to anybody else. But more than meets the eye, the American Revolution on its surface is about, rights and independence and all that good stuff that we all scream at the top of our lungs when we've had 4 beers and 8 hot dogs on the 4th of July. But in reality, a lot of it was just a rebellion against a very okay status quo that people were just no longer happy with, and an armed protest against perceived wrongs that escalated into a war that very few people actually wanted. So victors write the history. So because we won the American Revolution, the story is that from the get-go, it was a struggle for independence. And for decades, the American colonists knew that they were Americans and they didn't want to be English or British anymore, and that they were working towards the king letting them loose legally, because that's what large colonial empires do, is they just let their biggest group of colonies just walk out the front door and, give them a gift basket and shake their hand. In reality, things start brewing after the French and Indian War, where because of the scale of the war and because of the debts accrued, Parliament goes from a distant relationship with the American colonies to a direct relationship. So instead of letting them more or less do their own thing, unless it's highly illegal or highly detrimental to the economy of the empire, they really crack down and they impose the same English law they've put everywhere else in their empire at this point, which is the Caribbean and Canada for the most part. And Americans are like, hey, whoa, we don't like being told what to do. You've left us alone. But they still view themselves as Englishmen. And they argue the point that we are Englishmen, we deserve the rights of Englishmen, right up until the 1770s, where our favorite domestic terrorist group, the Sons of Liberty, decide that they're going to up the ante a little bit. And the only reason I call them a domestic terrorist group is because when you tar and feather somebody or burn their building down or throw state-owned goods in a harbor, when you win, you're freedom fighters. When you lose, you're a domestic terrorist group. The problem is you're committing acts of what we would call today domestic terrorism, regardless of whether you win or lose. And when you tar and feather somebody, you're killing them 9 times out of 10. So keep that in mind. And the next time you hear about the heroic Sons of Liberty tarring and feathering a British official, they killed that man, more than likely, because burning tar all over your body in an era without antibiotics is bad. And so long ran short, the founding fathers are men with high ideals. They are pillars of society. They are also smugglers and tax evaders and slave owners. So there's this whole second level of the American Revolution where it's rebellious personalities who are chafing against just living under what are honestly pretty reasonable laws for the most part, because they hadn't had to. And I'm not saying that that makes it right, wrong, or indifferent, but there's almost always a second level to anything that has happened in human history. And so this movie takes that belief and just cranks it to 11 and says, well, what if the second level is they were protecting a massive treasure? And I think that's why it rings so well for most people, is because we've all met humans and we all know that almost nobody has one motivation for doing things. And I think we're all, uncomfortable is not the right word, but we all take with a grain of salt this idea that throughout history, people had one idea and one motive and they pursued it and they won or they lost. And so I think they use our subconscious, like, people are complicated, and they go, yeah, people are really complicated. They're so complicated. They had a hidden treasure and they wrote a map on the back of the Declaration of Independence.
One of the things sort of like central to this whole movie that I feel is very American is this idea that this treasure keeps getting bigger and bigger, and they have to protect it because it's too much money for any one person. It's too much power, so you have to hide it from everybody. And I'm like, why don't you just break up that treasure and divide it amongst the people? But I guess that's too socialist for America.
Yeah, two things, Josh. First, that's socialism, you bloody Canadian. Don't bring that commie crap down across the border into my meth lab of country. um, Although, it's okay. Weirdly enough, the American founding fathers are one of history's greatest examples of do as I say and not as I do. Which is why for me personally, it's hard to pin down whether we should characterize them as guys who were self-serving who got lucky or guys who did legitimately want to impose social change. And I think the answer is they were both. I think they had lofty ideals. They were all Enlightenment thinkers, and the lofty ideals benefited them. So, circle fits the square. And if they had access to a large treasure, they probably would have just paid off the massive amounts of national debt they accrued, borrowing from France. However, there is for a long time in American history this concept of one man, one leader, one whoever should not have absolute power over everything, which is something that, ironically enough, some Americans are chafing against now, 150, 200 years later, 250 years later, which is crazy. But political rant aside, so that's the reason that in the Constitution we don't have a king, we have an elected leader, and that's the reason that we do have a Congress. And so it's very hyper Americanized, for sure, that we protect this treasure and we don't give it to anybody because they use that thing. But again, it's that taking things that aren't unrealistic as your base. And so the base of a new democracy that hasn't been around long enough to have its basic premise corrupted yet, because 50 years is not that long, honestly, possessing this massive treasure that they don't want any one ruler to get its hands on. Okay, whatever. And then you just crank it to an 11 to where they just hoard it, because that makes a better movie than them doing anything at all with it. So I agree with you that it's very American, but it's very well done, like over the top super American plot line of people don't need the money. We just need to hoard it like a dragon.
In researching this movie, because I know nothing about any of these things, so I have to research every little bit.
Valid.
Like we said, a lot of the stuff is pretty factual. It's tying up real stuff all together really well. There's a few cases, like if you read the IMDb goofs, there's a lot of contradictory stuff where people are very confident that something is a mistake, and then somebody else is very confident that it's not a mistake, so it's hard to tell sometimes. And so you talked about how Charles Mason really was the last surviving signer of the Declaration of Independence, and he was a Catholic, which was a big deal because everybody else was Protestant. But the movie says that he was also a Freemason. And most of the sources you find online say, no, he wasn't a Freemason because he was Catholic and Catholics weren't allowed to be Freemasons. And then there's a few sources that are like, you know what, you can just keep your secret society a secret because it's a secret society. So I don't actually know where to fall on that one, whether or not he was a Freemason.
I don't know, but the confirmed Freemasons of the Founding Fathers are George Washington, Benjamin Franklin, Paul Revere, John Hancock, James Monroe, who, considering him a founding father is a stretch, but that's okay. John Warren, James Otis, and 13 signers of the Constitution. So this idea that Freemasons are really prevalent in the founding of early United States government is based in fact. They're everywhere. This also helps the idea of do as I say, not as I do, because Freemasons, though it is certainly, like every other fraternity in the world, a bros club for bros, there have been times where these societies have actually dedicated themselves to something important. The French Revolution sees coffee bar chats turn into actual armed revolt. The American Revolution sees a group of Freemasons pursuing Freemasons' ideals of benefiting, quote unquote, all man, which in the 1700s meant all white men, but step in the right direction, I suppose. All white men is better than only some white men, I guess. But it's so you could argue, like you said, that there's no proof that Charles Carroll was a Freemason. You could also argue that, well, he's the only Catholic that's quote unquote allowed to be part of the dudes club that signs the Declaration of Independence. So does that maybe indicate that actually he was a Freemason and that the other Freemasons, because he shared their order, let him sign it? Is it completely unrelated? Probably, but it's fun to think about because we don't know, and secret societies are kept secret. So most of these guys did not walk around saying, "Hi, yeah, I'm a Freemason." But George Washington, for example, is a master Mason, which would indicate to me that he ranks pretty high on the old Masonry totem pole. So there's a lot going on. People have had personal lives and secrets since the beginning of time. People in prehistory had personal lives and secrets, as I'm sure you would spiel about to no end. And so this idea that because we have a couple documents, we know everything about these people is completely untrue. So yeah, we may never know if Charles Carroll was actually a Freemason, but it's cool that they used him because he's the only one that would have lived long enough to fit the plot point. So for the purpose of the movie, yeah, you're darn skippy. He's a Freemason.
I'm going to issue an immediate correction because I called him Charles Mason, and I have mixed up because he was a Mason. I don't want to get listener mail over that one. His name is Charles Carroll.
Man, your listeners are so much more into it than ours are. I've had exactly one negative YouTube comment in the year and a half that we've been doing this, and he was like, "Hey, in Braveheart, those aren't the four corners of Scotland." And I said, "Yeah, you're right. Sorry, my mistake." And then that was that was it.
If you want to get negative YouTube comments, do something with Graham Hancock, because we just put up a Graham Hancock episode, and the negative comments just pour in.
All I'd have to do is actually have a a history-based episode of our podcast instead of a film-based one, but I think that's why we keep it the way we keep it. So.
Okay. I like to be pedantic in our nitpicking of inaccuracies, and there's not a lot here, but I've got a few things.
Go for it.
We're going to go rapid fire a few really pedantic things. They find this pipe in the ship, and they realize part of it is a
cylinder seal.
It's a cylinder seal, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And so he cuts himself and uses the blood as the ink, and he rolls it out. But when he puts the blood on it, clearly the writing is recessed. It's carved. It's engraved into it. And so when he rolls it, the writing should appear in a negative. It should appear full red with white writing, but it appears as if it had raised lettering. And so that is obviously, that's not a historical inaccuracy, but that is just a filmmaking inaccuracy.
Yeah, ironically, I think a lot of the inaccuracies are in the process of them revealing these things. Like the history is almost as airtight as it can be. One that you might bring up, but if you use hair dryers on the Declaration of Independence, you're going to kill it because it is a 250-year-old piece of paper. You're either going to light it on fire or it's going to disintegrate into if there is a heat revealed map on the back of the Declaration of Independence, we're never, ever, ever going to know it's back there because you cannot heat a 250-year-old piece of paper.
But what if you soak it in lemon juice first?
Nope. Then it just dissolves.
Is it paper or is it vellum?
It is. Yeah, that's a good question. Let me look. Let me see if I can find out.
It's always referred to as parchment. John Voight in the movie says it looks like an animal skin.
Mm-hmm. So paper. So it was the paper they had back then. So paper through history is fascinating because paper gets less durable the closer you get to the modern era because it's easier to make
and cheaper.
So part of the reason that newspapers, like just normal newspapers, can survive 200, 300 years is because of the way it's like a hybrid of parchment and paper, because parchment's its own separate thing used in the Middle Ages. It's just really thick, really substantial paper because the only way you could communicate were paper copies. And so this idea that paper is insubstantial and easily ripped and easily ruined back then did not fly, because the only way you got a newspaper from Europe to the colonies was to pack 10,000 of them in a box and sail them across the Atlantic for however long, or treaties or money or what have you. And so paper had to be a more substantial type of paper than it is now. So it's still paper by every meaning of the word. It's just a different formula and a different design of it for a different purpose. Paper now is supposed to be expendable. Paper then was supposed to be substantial. So
cool.
when they're looking for the secret code on the back of the declaration, John Voight refers to the type of ink that he suspects is on it as ferrous sulfate, and apparently this would be the type of ink that they would use to actually make invisible ink during the Revolutionary War. So they really did write in invisible ink and use heat to expose the message, which is pretty interesting.
And oak galls as well are historically a known source of ink. If I could put my zoologist hat on for a second, galls are really interesting because they're essentially like plant tumors that are caused by wasps. So you'll find them quite often on trees to just look like kind of bumps, and oak galls are the ones they talk about as being the source of the ink that they use back in the day. But they're essentially like hatcheries for baby wasps, and each species of wasps has a different tree preference and can produce different kinds of galls. So that's pretty cool.
To go back, speaking of fun chemical differences, to go back to the paper question, I dug a little deeper just because I wanted to refresh some things I used to know in undergrad. And part of it is that paper was just also made from different things. So it wasn't wood pulp. It was rags and cotton fibers and things like that
as well.
Yeah, and so it's still paper because paper is a catch-all term. But yeah, you're right. It was a different material altogether for the fact that it had to last longer, and also extracting wood pulp takes a whole lot of technology that people have not always had access to. So yeah, it's interesting how that's a fun historical tidbit, how words and things are not always the same, even though we assume them to be. So they'd have called it paper back then too, but it was not the paper that we use today. It would have been more like a dollar bill is now.
And this sort of ties in as well to, one of the problems with these kind of films is that they have these riddles and clues and stuff, and they kind of rely on the idea that language is static and that words don't change, and that something that made sense in the 1700s would still make sense in the 2000s. But that's really not the case at all. Like if you've ever read old riddles, of which there's like a collection, I mean, some of them just make no sense at all to a modern reader, and the ones that do are just so obvious that it's just not even a riddle. I mean, yeah.
An example of this language changing is the way Sean Bean realizes who Silence is. He's reading the text that they've copied by hand, and he's like, "Why is Silence capitalized?" And like, "Well, you wrote it. Like, maybe that's just random. Maybe you just randomly wrote it that way." Yep. But still, so they copied it faithfully. They capitalized the parts that were supposed to be capitalized, and they realized Silence is the name of a person, and it's the Silence Do Good letters. But if you go and actually read the Silence Do Good letters, people just randomly capitalized words at that time. There's just like every fourth word is capitalized for no reason.
Yeah. Well, and it was because they wrote in cursive all the time. Like nobody wrote in actual print. And so it was personalization, but it was so you could keep track of like the flow of the sentence, because it would all cram together so quickly that it was almost like it was the historic equivalent of using a double space when there used to be typewriters, because the space was so small. Same thing. If I capitalize a letter randomly once in a while, you can track like where you're at in where the words end. Capital letters also used to look different. So a capital S did not always look like a capital S. If I'm remembering right, it used to be, if it started a paragraph, it was like an F almost.
Yes. And I've actually read that in the actual Declaration of Independence, which is so faded that it's almost impossible to read now, which is not what it looks like in the movie. But it uses those F-shaped S's, but in reproductions, like for the public, they've replaced those with modern S's because it would look too funny and weird. And so apparently the actual declaration that they use in the movie, where you can actually read it, it's not actually a faithful reproduction of the original in that way.
Yeah. One thing that though does, even though some of the tone of the movie is impressive because they don't go out and say it, but they say it. So they never outwardly say the founding fathers were masters of the media of their time, but they were. Like these guys were eloquent to a T. Even George Washington, who is far and away the least eloquent of the founding fathers, can give a speech.
Mm.
They're passionate people, and part of it is the writing style of the time. Part of it is so few people relative to the population could read and write that it was more artsy. But even by the standards of the 1700s, like these guys can they're social media influencers of their time. Like these guys can write the Facebook post that's going to change your political opinion for a day.
That's why the president today is the social media influencer of our time.
I mean,
the president of 2 months from now.
Hearts and minds have always been as important as facts. Like people are passionate creatures. So if you can tug on my heartstrings, you have as good of a chance of changing my mind as a guy who can slide facts across the desk and be like, hey, man, England's not actually oppressing us. They're just treated us like they should have been for the last 100 years of our existence.
Going back to your point about the changing in punctuation and capitalization, I think it's interesting that they have changed the F-shaped S's to modern S's, because it would be quite funny to read, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, that they are endowed with the Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. I think that would change it somewhat, maybe make it better. I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know. It's interesting too that part of it is these at the time this is being written, that version of English has only been around for about 150 years, which is not a short amount of time, but for the history of the English language is a flash in the pan, because prior to the 1600s it's still medieval English, and it's still Middle English. And so if you or 1500, so if you read a document from like 1450 from England versus 1550 from England, they're wildly different. Where now if you read a document from 1820 or 1924, it reads almost the exact same as like now.
Yeah, and I think also it's important as well that the Caxton and the printing press, and before printing becomes widespread and books become, or pamphlets become attainable, like spelling was not standardized, and people would spell things however they damn wanted. Especially when you have a country like England or Scotland or Wales, where you have hugely varying dialects within very small parts of the country. Yeah, it can make documents from that time period pre-printing very difficult to understand.
You also have a group of men who are all English by law, insert nationality here by choice or by fate. And so they've all been trained in proper English, as we would call it now, like English. They all know how to write, but they're from very different aspects of life. And so George Washington is born and raised in the Virginia colony. So he's English society, but he's Virginia English society. And Patrick Henry is off the boat from England at some point in the 1700s. And Alexander Hamilton is from the British Caribbean. And so a lot of the style is cool because it's one man, whether it's the Continental Scribe or Thomas Jefferson or whoever writes each document, trying to coalesce what I'm sure was this crazy amalgamation of verbal nuances and differences, because we honestly cannot picture what those discussions would have sounded like, because the accents don't exist anymore. There is no population of second generation English immigrants to an English colony in Virginia anymore. So this, how they would have spoken and how it would have been slightly different than their fathers spoke and all that, is not an important historical fact, but a cool one. Like it's a cool thing to think about.
So you say spelling wasn't standardized at the time. Another thing that wasn't standardized was time, and there's a whole bunch of things I want to talk about here. So there's a scene where they get a clue on $100 bill. They say that the clock in Independence Hall says 2:22, and then they use this to figure out that at that time, the shadow cast by the spire at the top of the tower is going to point to the location of their next clue. And so, first of all, I don't know that I've ever actually seen an American $100 bill in person. Kyle, I don't know if you've looked closely at it.
I was a bank teller once upon a time. There is indeed a clock
so
on the back.
There is a clock. What time does the clock say?
Brother, I couldn't tell you. I was more worried about using the fancy Sharpie to make sure they weren't counterfeit, you know? But
I think that says something about our respective careers that none of us have seen $100 bill in the flesh, apart from working for the man at the bank.
this is also 20 years ago, and I have no idea how often currency is updated in the UK or in Canada, but here about every 10 to 20 years, some of our bills get altered a little bit to help against counterfeiting. And so $100 bill in 2004 looks not substantially different in design, but substantially different in what you can read on the back because they're not the blue tint that they are now. So,
but it's certainly not going to be the same as the $100 bill in the 1770s.
No, and that's the weird part, right? It's like, but it was based on the painting. Is a little tidbit in the movie. So that's how it's amazing how they get around their own potential historical gaping holes and turn them into like really small holes.
Okay, here, let me go through. I spent a bit of time on this one. Today, the American $100 bill says 1030. The movie is 20 years old. So that bill was introduced in 2013. The bill that would have been around in 2004 said 410. But if you mix up your hour and minute hand, 410 looks a lot like 222. So it looked like the bill said 222, but officially it's 410.
Man,
that's just a Mason plot. They just spread that misinformation.
Yeah, maybe this is the conspiracy theory.
That's the genius of having the Masons in there, that everything can just be, a secret plot.
Yeah. It's also incredible that the Masons just lurk in the background of like the history of the West, starting in like, the 1600s. They're just there.
But so they say that the engraving used to make the bill, and apparently the one from before 2013 and the one from after 2013 with different times were engravings from the same guy in the early 1900s. They say that those engravings were based on a painting by a friend of Benjamin Franklin's from the 1780s. That's what they say in the movie, to get around the fact that the American $100 bill with Independence Hall on it wasn't introduced until the 1930s. But Independence Hall in the 1780s didn't look as it does today. Apparently, there was no clock on it at the time. That was introduced much later. And the engravings that were done by this guy in the early 1900s that are actually used for the American $100 bill are not apparently based on any painting, because the actual paintings of Independence Hall that Ben Franklin's friend made are from a totally different angle than the ones on the American $100 bill. So that one's a bit of a stretch. Now, the other thing about this is they say 222 is the time, and they have to go to Independence Hall, and the sun will cast a shadow which will point them to the place at exactly 222. And they realize it's already 3 o'clock, and then Riley is like, "Oh, I'm smarter than you. Actually, I realized that it's daylight savings." Apparently, I didn't double check this one, but somebody else noted that there is a calendar somewhere in the movie that identifies it as early November, so we wouldn't be on daylight savings time. We would have been back to standard time as of like a week before the movie is set, which is a nice catch that I can attribute to somebody else. I didn't double check that one.
That's true. Yeah, daylight savings time is usually March through the first week of November, or the first weekend in November. So yeah.
I don't know about the States, but this changed, because in Canada it used to be like second last week of October, and then they changed it, so now it's the first weekend of November. So I feel like in 2004, actually whoever, I can't remember if I saw this on IMDb Goofs or something, but they did identify the exact date that daylight savings would have been in 2004, just to make sure.
October 31st in 2004. So yeah, no, they did their work. God bless Google. Let me tell you.
But I mean, you're probably going to mention this, Josh, but as well, what doesn't make any sense is that it doesn't tell you what time of the year that you're supposed to be looking at. Like, one of the most basic things about, as we've talked about before, like last week in the Hancock episode about sun position, is that it varies throughout the year, and that's why things like the temples that the Maya put up only work on certain days because each day the sun is in a different position in the sky, and it does the kind of it moves in a circle because we're moving around it.
I also would be curious as to when leap years were implemented, which I could look up because that also throws
I
off.
think that one is quite old. I think they've known that for 1,000 years or more.
Well, the switch from the kind of Gregorian to the Julian calendar is, I think, in either the 17th or the 18th century, and there's big complaints about it because obviously within that switch you have to kind of reset everything. So a lot of workers complained that they were losing money because, although they weren't, just
Workers always
the
think they're
shifting of the
losing money.
days, they thought that we're going to get stiffed on our kind of monthly paycheck. So yeah, certainly that's something that happened fairly long ago.
You're right. That was already implemented. It's also though this thing that like people forget how much time passes. So it's also just the thing that the Earth is not in the exact same position in the loop every March 3rd for the last 4 billion years. Like that's not how celestial orbiting works. And so the pinpoint of it is impossible, as we've already established, especially without knowing the time of year and the day. Unrelated but fun historical fact, during World War I, the Russian Empire did not use the Gregorian calendar yet. And so you find battles that were fought at any time before World War I have two different dates. They have the Russian date and they have the everybody else date because the Russians were still using the Julian calendar. So there's a really big argument for a long time about when the Russian Revolution actually happened because Russians were like, oh, it was this day. And the rest of the world was like, nah, bro, it was this day. Catch up.
Another thing is that they say that Benjamin Franklin was the first person to propose daylight savings time, and that's not true. What he did was while he was like ambassador in France or whatever his role was in France, he wrote a satirical column talking about how they could save a lot of money if they woke up earlier because they'd use less candles. It was like supposed to be funny.
Yeah.
It doesn't make sense for him to propose daylight savings time because standardized time didn't even exist. Standardized time doesn't come in until the trains do because before that, every town would just set their clocks to the sun and, time would just sort of gradually shift as you move west. But when they invented the trains, now they're moving between large spaces of time, and the trains have to be on schedule. And so if the towns are off by half an hour, if they're at, opposite sides of a time zone, the train is going to be arriving like at wildly different times and there's no way to predict it. So this is why time zones were invented, and daylight savings doesn't make any sense unless you have time zones, right?
Yeah. And it was also like, it was heavily implemented because of the industrialization of places, which I'm not going to get into because it's irrelevant to the movie. But long story short, most of the things that we take for granted today in the US, at least, are 150 years old or less. Like that's the general rule of thumb is that most things that you think are hallmarks of life, 150 years is like the cutoff for a lot of them, with the exception of the Bill of Rights and the Constitution and Americans liking guns and like that kind of stuff. But yep. It's also, again, the myth of Benjamin Franklin is hilarious because the man was brilliant. He did invent many things. He was also like, it's like somebody took your boozing, strip club going, weirdly charismatic uncle who's wildly intelligent and turned him into the scholar of his time because the man had a prostitute in like every city in France that we're pretty sure. So, and he also helped I wrote it, some relation, I think like his nephew or his stepnephew, smuggled dead bodies into a house in England to do scientific exploration on them. Like he's not a bad man by any stretch of the imagination. He's just not this. We have this idea of Benjamin Franklin as like the reverent old like sage of the founding fathers. And in reality, if any of you have a grandpa who refuses to accept that he's 75 and says wacky stuff and is brilliant and can like duct tape his tractor together and make it run for 50 years, and then he says something, and because he survived so many things, you think that he must be onto something, that's Benjamin Franklin. Like he's the wildly intelligent, probably mildly autistic guy who just runs around. And at the point that he says some of these things, whatever he says is just accepted as something that should happen because he does invent the bifocals and discover electricity and convince France to join the war and all of these very important things. He has like 5 big accolades under his belt at a time where most people don't. And so they're like, okay, Ben said it, must be a good idea.
Okay, something I spent an inordinate amount of research on was the George Washington campaign buttons. So in an early scene when we first meet, what's her name? Abigail?
Dr. Chase.
Abigail Chase.
Abigail Chase, who gets chased a lot.
I don't know if we mentioned it, but all of the characters in this movie have names that are amalgamations or pieces of historical characters. So Abigail Chase is Abigail, somebody who is the wife of somebody, and somebody Chase, who are both founding fathers.
Oh, it's Abigail Adams is
Adams.
Where Abigail comes from. I'm not, off the top of my head, I don't know where Chase comes from. But
the wife of the beer guy?
Oh.
No,
Abigail Adams is the wife of John Adams, actually, the president.
John Adams, of
the
course,
cousin
is a founding
of the beer
father.
guy.
So she's got a collection of George Washington campaign buttons, and if you look closely at them, they are actually all real George Washington campaign buttons. That's a very nice attention to detail. He notes that she's missing the 1789 inaugural button, and the one that he gives her really is a 1789 inaugural button. And so that's like, I start getting into this. I'm like, wow, this is great attention to detail. You start digging in further. I found a book called George Washington Inaugural Buttons and Medalettes, 1789 and 1793, by J. Harold Cobb, with revisions by a few people in 1968 and in 2005. I don't know when the original copy is made here, but there's an old book. Anyway, it's way too long. Actually, it's not that long. It's only 30 pages, but I couldn't read the whole thing.
They always are, Josh. No matter how long they are, history books are always too long. And speaking as a guy who had to read about 175 of them.
Yeah. But it's got images of these medals and or these buttons, and they all look accurate to the ones that we see there. There's a couple of problems. He says that she's almost got a complete set, but she's missing the 1789 inaugural button. She's got about 9 buttons on that board. According to this book, there are roughly 70 different variants, so she's pretty far off of a complete set. He also says she's missing the 1789 inaugural, and there was a different source that said, probably all of those buttons could be referred to as a 1789 inaugural because, according to this book anyway, I guess he campaigned twice in 1789 and 1793. So, I mean, you're not going to have buttons from every single year. You're only going to have them from the campaign year. So, yeah. Oh, also, the one that he does give her is actually already on the board. It's identical to one that's already on the board. It might not be identical. Like there's variations in the text, which I can't say for sure because you got to really zoom in, and we don't have the resolution on them because they're usually pretty far away. Another thing is that I did find one of these actual buttons for sale on eBay for about $8,500 American, and he just gives her that one. So she's like, normally I wouldn't be able to accept a gift like this, but I really wanted it. And I'm like, oh, I don't know that you're allowed to really want a gift that is $8,500. I feel like that's, if
bad.
It was a $10 gift, you could sweep it under the rug, but I don't know that you can accept that.
It is part of his plan. So if you notice, he covers it in the special kind of UV glowing liquid, so that when she's going to pick it up because she really wants it. But then when she puts her PIN code in, he can then see which buttons she's pressed. This is why this movie, when you dig into it, it's so tight. Like it's not my favorite movie. I'm not that big into the action scenes. I was zoning out through most of it, but every time you dig into these little details, it's so tightly written. Like everything means something. So I was wondering why he dipped it in the stuff, and I never made that connection. But you're right. That's why she did it. He did it so she would
get her fingerprints on the cup.
Mm-hmm.
And like, yeah, stuff like that. Like every little thing comes back. And when you said he jumped off the aircraft carrier with no diving training, that's not true. They mentioned specifically at some point that he has diving training, and he gives his watch as collateral, which is a diving watch.
Oh,
he
you're
specifically
right.
points it out.
You're right. They do.
So it's a tight movie. Like they're foreshadowing everything, and it's sometimes really subtle. And that's the other thing about this movie is they do the film writing thing, which is they show, they don't tell, right? This movie was one where it's always one step ahead of me because I'm watching it critically and I'm trying to pick up plot holes, and I'm like, okay, so you've explained that when the Declaration of Independence needs to go for restoration, it goes to this place, but you haven't explained why it would be going for restoration during the gala. That doesn't make any sense. And then cut to the next scene, they're triggering the what do you call it? The defenses for the heat sensors, and causing it to go for restoration. I'm like, wow, you didn't tell me that, but you just showed it happening, and it makes sense. So like, I have to give this movie credit for being really, like, it ties everything together. It's really tight. Everything works apart from a few of these plot holes. Not so much plot holes, but
leaps of faith.
a couple of things that
fabrications.
Yeah. And again, as far as how much is historically accurate, or at least pretty close to it, like, you can't really ask for that much more from a movie like this.
Especially one that's not trying to sell you something that, like, they're not trying to give you an interpretation of history. They're just very much like, what if? It's a what if movie, and they just do what you do. They find as much feasible evidence as possible, and then they plug in a couple of critical plot holes to just make sure that it works. And then after that, like, they're not saying there is definitively this treasure. Like, they're not a mockumentary or something like that, or they're not The Patriot where they're trying to sell you stuff that happened that didn't. They're just like, hey, what if there was a heist on the Declaration of Independence?
Yeah. One thing I have to point out that while I was watching it occurred to me is that it's essentially, it shares perhaps too many commonalities with the first half of Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. So you have, a lot of the similar beats. You have this kind of treasure quest where you've got clues hidden everywhere that have to be followed. You've even got a blonde German love interest who he has to choose between the fabled artifact that they're looking for and saving her. Mm-hmm. So in Indiana Jones, you've got the moment where the Grail Cup has fallen into the chasm, and Elsa is trying to reach it while Indy's trying to save her by holding her hand. And in the end, she wants the Grail Cup more than she wants to survive, and so she plummets to her death. And in this one, you've got the moment on the elevator, the wooden elevator, where you've got Dr. Chase being held in one hand by Nick Cage, and you've got the Declaration of Independence teetering on the edge on the other side. So I think that's something that was not very subtle, which should maybe have some points deducted from the film for.
Yeah. Okay, on the one hand, that's true. On the other hand, how dare you, sir? Like, no, how dare you? No, come on, man. How dare you expose American movie making to using one of the same 15 basic plot lines over and over again? How we can't all be as sophisticated as a well-spoken Scottish doctor with his, with his books behind him, all right?
They've even got father-son issues like Last Crusade as well with John Boyd and Nick Cage.
Why are you doing this to me? Ross, my man.
Sorry.
No, that's okay. That's okay. Look, it's kind of like how after Star Wars, every sci-fi movie is kind of just Star Wars. Like, just, but yeah, no, I see that. I think on the flip side, though, what it avoided doing pretty well is a lot of the classic tropes for heist movies aren't necessarily there, because it doesn't feel, and I think this was it doesn't feel like an Ocean's 11 movie. I don't know which one came first, but it doesn't. It's part of that. It's a little weaker than a normal action movie, and it's a little weaker than a normal heist movie. But it's one of the few that does this hybrid fusion thing where it's not all brilliance. Some of it is pure luck. Like some of it is not. I like how they didn't do Ian outsmarted us. Ian, at no point, the bad guy, at no point outsmarts them. He just gets lucky. And I feel like that adds a level of realism to it. Like you can be the smartest human being in the universe, and sometimes you're gonna trip, and the Declaration of Independence is gonna roll out into the intersection. And sometimes you're going to be so hyper focused on the guy who's almost as smart as you are that you forget that a bunch of federal agents who arguably are not as smart as you, but there's 150 of them, are also tailing you and are going to find you. So, and it's not, he doesn't mess up and get found by the feds. They find his car. You know, it's very plausible things. Like this is how we undermine people who are probably more clever than we are. We just like go this way. So
this movie, it has so many details we could dig into. We're probably not going to have to get to everything that I have in my notes here. One thing that I do want to talk about is the only real archaeological thing we can go on here is this treasure at the end. And so the movie sets it out like the treasure is worth money. That's the main thing. And then of course we get to the end and our main character is a good guy. He doesn't actually care about the money. He cares about the history and all this. And he's like, I'm going to donate it to a museum and just take a small giant finder's fee.
I don't know how to tell you this.
Right.
There's no historian in the world that is not so far in debt in some way, shape, or form that you would donate the 10% finder's fee. You wouldn't demand more than it, but let me tell you, dude, I almost died 18 times to find this. Whatever 10% is of millions of physical pounds of gold, I want it. Hand it over.
Okay, so I don't know. I don't know where this finder's fee comes from. I didn't look into that. Like, is there a finder's fee if you find treasure?
Yeah. So here in the States, I want to say it's 10%. There's a pretty standard if you find it and it's either American property or within American sovereignty, you are entitled to a certain percentage of it. It's why we have such a large treasure hunting culture here. Which has found, in the past some pretty cool things. The Spanish fleet that sank in the 1680s, I think, was found by an American treasure hunter. So there have been some pretty cool discoveries made because of it, but it's just I don't want to call it a gimmick. It's a agreement that the United States government has kind of reached with treasure hunters to like, hey, your incentive to find this and to tell us about it so that the black market is not flooded with a bunch of currency is we'll cut you a slice. And most things that people are going to spend tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands of dollars searching for are hundreds of millions of dollar fines if they find them. So like the Spanish fleet that was found in the 80s is just like you can't put it into numerical value today because the gold is purer than the gold we use. There's so much of it. It's like the economic and the historical value of a lot of these treasures is just astronomical. So he would receive a very, very, very hefty chunk of change if he found something like that.
So the other side of that is you say if it's like what do you say if it's American property or something like that, but obviously none of these finds are American. These are all looted from the old world, and old world countries are all going to have an interest in this, like Egypt in particular. A lot of this stuff is from Egypt. Egypt is really they're really into getting their stuff repatriated that was stolen, and of course none of this stuff left Egypt under like legal circumstances, right?
Yeah, and I think the waters get murkier there when it's it's difficult because like it's within United States territory. And so I think
that's what the United States can claim. Egypt isn't going to care about that.
Egypt's not going to care. No, I'm not saying that we would have a right to it, but it's the finder's fee is the finder's fee. In the sense that as far as what's to do with it and how to proceed, it is if it's in United States sovereignty, you as a treasure hunter do not have legal standing. Like that's how, and that's probably true everywhere. I would hope. Like that's
as a Brit, it's very much off the finders keepers, losers weepers. That's how we roll.
Bro, I need to move to England. Holy cow!
Yeah. The longer ago it was stolen, the more legal claim we tend to have to it. So
yeah, and that's relatively true here. It's just every country does it differently, but we generally speaking we have a standardized percentage of a finder's fee. But usually you're a treasure hunter that is operating with the knowledge of the federal government. If you're launching an expedition big enough to find a treasure like this, you got to tell them because you're going to be digging up sewers in New York City and all sorts of stuff. So in this situation, it would be weird. Giving the treasure back would be weird. I'm sure like you'd have to, but if they can take things out of the British Museum and put them back in Cairo, like yeah, but it's just like long, really fun rant that we just had short. It's basically just this thing that the United States does to encourage people to report treasures found to them so that they can be placed in museums or federal archives or what have you, instead of a lot of untracked and incomparable wealth just circulating underneath the surface.
I mean, it's also for the benefit of archaeology as well. I guess. I mean, that's how it runs in the UK anyway. That apart from I think Northern Ireland, metal detecting is legal. But if you find what's classed as treasure trove, so that's things that have monetary value that are older than 150 years or something, and are made of precious metals, then you have to report that. And then, but if you don't, then there are some serious legal repercussions. In fact, like just the other week, some guys got some pretty hefty jail time for discovering like a Viking hoard of silver and selling on a coin at a time for quite a lot of money, but without declaring it. And so they actually have got jail time for that because they should have reported it. And then what happens usually is it gets assessed and a fair value is assigned to it. It gets kept by the kind of museum sector, but the actual value gets given to the finders who can then share it amongst usually themselves and the landowner whose land the objects were found on.
Yeah, here, as a hoity-toity, privileged, educated historian, Brad, that makes me sick. Give the Viking silver hoard to the museums. How dare you? You still would have. They'd have paid you so much money. Like, what are you doing?
Yeah.
Anyway.
Yeah. And luckily, that is the sort of general public opinion. So, the story that these guys have gone to jail for essentially stealing it from the nation, and for something as tawdry as cold hard cash. I think that the sort of general public are very much on the side of this stuff. It belongs in a museum, to quote one of our favorite characters.
Yeah, and what's better, $10 million that is given to you for a legal transaction with your government, or $100 million and your ass is sitting in prison? Like, how does that bet? They'll just take it all. But one thing that I think part of the reason it's so firm here is, and since Josh is from Canada, he can commiserate with me. Western countries on this side of the ocean don't have history like Europe does. And so there's not nearly as much stuff to be found. And so my odds of finding a Roman coin on a beach are astronomically lower than they are over there. And so I think part of it is also the idea that there's just less. There's less historical artifacts. There are less that we can find. There are less of significance. Most of it does not belong to us if you really get down to the nitty gritty.
We can't forget like Mesoamerican and sort of Central American, South American cultures, which have fantastic artworks made of precious metals, which are still being found.
Oh yeah, they exist. But they don't. And the thing is, they don't belong to the governments that they're found in either, technically speaking. But a lot of it too is I had the pleasure of going to southwestern England. Oh God, 6 years ago now, and my friend who lives there was telling me about all the really cool old stuff, and it was all 800-900 years old, as I'm sitting in a cafe that used to be the Royal Tuberculosis Ward for Bath, England, that was built 50 years before my country was a thing. And I'm like, bro, I can't this whole country is old. Like, I can't. But there's also a fun history in the United States of conspiracy theories that are, those conspiracy theories that are a little too true for your liking, like you don't want to believe them, but you're like, oh, maybe. There's a fun thing that occasionally happens here where treasures that people are pretty sure they found just aren't there when they get there. So especially like Civil War gold or things like that. I wrote a whole YouTube script for the Dark 5 channel about these guys who seem to have found a very large stash of Civil War era minted gold in the hills of Pennsylvania, I think. So much so that the federal government was excited and backed them, and then they were kept off the dig site for a day because of weather or some weird excuse. And then when they got back, the hole that they had scanned that had showed like large amounts of metal in it was empty. And so we do have this thing that I am by no means a conspiracy theorist, but I'm pretty sure once in a blue moon, the federal agencies decide they don't want to pay the finder's fee, and just take the stuff. And that's more of like things that are very clearly U.S. property, so like U.S. minted gold. I think the legality of whether you're entitled to finder's fee is kind of weird on that, and so that one was probably just we don't want to have to prove to these guys that they're not entitled to anything because technically it's still federal U.S. property, sort of deal. But there, once in a while, you'll come across one where you're like, oh, maybe they did steal that out from under you. I'm sorry, that's unfortunate.
Well, while we're talking about conspiracy theories, and I hate that it comes to this so often on our episodes here, but the thing that I don't like about this movie is the way we have a main character who is shunned by academia, who has a crazy idea, but is vindicated in the end. And, I hate this because of the way popular culture influences public perception. But again, this is sort of this American exceptionalism idea, this individualism where one guy can overturn everything everybody knows. And we see this in a lot of stuff. Like this is like central to Stargate, which we haven't covered, but I think we're going to have to do eventually. It's also just sort of this general idea in science where, a single scientist, one mad scientist will do some crazy thing. We have that in 2012, where we have that one scientist who figures out what's happening and can't get anybody else's attention because they think it's too crazy, right? We have this idea where one person who nobody believes is actually right. And in real life, that never, ever happens. Ross, can you think of any situations in archaeology or science where a single person has an idea that totally contradicts the current paradigm, and everybody rejects them until that single person overturns the paradigm on their own?
I guess the only one I can sort of think of straight away is Schliemann and Troy,
and that's not really in our modern scientific era.
No,
right? This is.
That's also that was also being wrong until coincidence kind of proved you right. That was you were incorrect in all of your reasonings, and it just so happened that you won the lottery on guessing that might have been real.
We do have, like, it is true that paradigms get overturned, and I hate to always bring it back to Graham Hancock, but he loves this idea because it serves him well, because he's an outsider, he's not an archaeologist, and he uses this idea that one guy can actually know the truth, and he's being shut out of academia. But he's got the real information, and the academics are trying to shut him down for some reason because, whatever. But he likes to draw attention to places where, like, times when paradigms did shift, and he is still talking about the Clovis first, which somehow in the popular opinion won't die. People, like, every year you get a new articles like, wow, we finally have evidence to disprove Clovis, but like, no, that's been disproved for 30 years, right?
It's kind of like how Hitler's dental records are very clearly in Moscow, and they've proven it and they've tested it, and there's always that moron who's like, nah, he escaped Argentina. I'm like, well, did he leave his entire jaw behind, my guy?
Yeah. And, like, there's a lot of examples of this, but in the case of Clovis first, it's not an outsider who has a crazy idea. It is insiders discovering new information, and there is resistance at first because you have a theory that's built up on the information, on the evidence that's available. But as the evidence changes, the theory changes, and it is my sort of understanding about the way academia works is it's always the old guys that are holding on to the old ideas, and eventually they die and retire, and the younger people bring in the new ideas, which is I mean, it is evidence that science isn't purely objective. There's ego involved in stuff like this, but it's never a single person who is rejected who is eventually redeemed, right? We see the same thing in geology with plate tectonics.
Yeah, Wagner and plate tectonics.
We can see it in paleoanthropology with Neanderthal and modern human interbreeding, which before 2010 was generally thought could never happen. And then after 2010, well, the evidence is there, and now the paradigm shifts. But it's always insiders, and it's always teams and groups. It's never a single individual.
The classic the description of Hancock that I always like is that he's like, they laughed at Leonardo da Vinci, they laughed at Galileo, they laughed at Columbus, and then go, yeah, but they also laughed at clowns,
Yeah.
That's how it goes.
That's also, like, I think the thing is that it's always like taking the wrong lessons from history. nobody laughed at Galileo because they thought he was wrong. They locked Galileo in his house because when he laid out the evidence, the clergy was like, "Oh crap, that guy's
Hmm.
probably
Yeah.
onto something, and we can't
Yeah.
have that." So it's not being laughed at because you are factually wrong and being repressed because you are going against an oppressive status quo look
Hmm.
the same but are very, very different. And it
Hmm.
takes exactly 3.5 minutes of reading a Wikipedia article to figure out which one it is. In history, we the weird part of the reason that survives in history is because there are objectively a handful of individuals who have changed the course of human history, not by themselves, but Genghis Khan, Napoleon Bonaparte, Alexander the Great. There are once in a while, Marie Curie, to launch a scientific history example. Once in a blue moon, there are people who seem to be the focal point of a shift in the way the human timeline is going. But the problem is Genghis Khan by himself did not conquer half of the known world. Genghis Khan, with his horde of well trained Mongol warriors, conquered the known world. And so it's this perception that one person did it. And it's like, no,
Hmm.
one person was the spear point for like this entire thing that happened.
Hmm.
Um, Julius Caesar did not undermine the Republic and start the Roman Empire. He was just the last guy. He was the linchpin. Like what he did culminated 300 years of like the decay of the Roman Republic. And
Hmm.
so,
Hmm.
but that's how we teach it, right? Because it's difficult to teach people who aren't super interested in it all the lessons. And so the lesson you get from World War II is Churchill was right. Like, the Nazis were bent on world domination. And that one is problematic not because he was wrong, but because it was really obvious even at the time, and that's more of a people didn't want another world war. It was less that nobody else thought that, and they all were just like, no, it's okay. Which just pay no attention to the Messerschmitts behind the curtain over there. It's all good, but it's basically like so social memory fights history a lot, and I don't know that seems to be true in archaeology and paleoarchaeology as well, but people's desire to perceive what happened versus what actually happened often culminates in that. And what's the sexier story, right? That
Hmm.
maybe human technology has been lost or aliens. Like what's I had a professor all the time say pirates are sexy. That's why people study them more than they should. Like Caribbean pirates, the idea of sailing around the ocean pillaging are sexy. The idea of rowing around the Aegean 1,000 years earlier and bringing Rome to heel is less sexy because you're rowing and you don't have big flowy hats and guns. So you fight. You do. I think, and this movie is in that regard. It's sexy, like one guy against known fact, and it's great to think it, but it's not a thing. Like you guys said, it's not a thing that happens. Like there's never only one person who has the truth. It might be a very small minority of people, like washing hands in the 1600s. A handful of people seem to do that for reasons they didn't understand, but they realized people died less when they'd operate on them. But it wasn't just one guy. It's never there's never one dude or one woman changing everything. It's not how it works.
Yeah.
Well, we're up to an hour and a half here, so we're getting pretty long for an episode. Does anybody have anything really important they want to say before we finish up this movie?
No, well, no, not for the movie. I will say though that if you guys enjoyed the historical airtightness of this movie, you should watch the movie Amistad. Shameless plug to your listeners and you guys. It's about a prison group, a group of slaves who were imprisoned on a slave ship in the 1830s, I believe, who revolted and navigated the ship to Boston and were engaged in a legal court case about whether they were legally enslaved or legally free. And the movie does a very good job of following the events of it. And it's a very powerful movie. I don't want to spoil it by saying whether it's like hopeful or not. So I'll just leave with it's a powerful movie. And if you guys liked how airtight this one was, it's a different tone because it's a purely historical movie, but it's really good. And the facts track very well through it.
It sounds like a movie we watched called Skullduggery, which has a legal court case to determine if an ape man was illegally a person and could be enslaved.
Yeah.
Yes.
Sort of. I mean, I would
Sorry,
say,
I don't know why I felt like I need to reference
Yeah.
that movie. We have, Ross, we have a few older episodes, which our newer episodes are starting to get some good traction on YouTube. Our older episodes that are so ridiculous that like I need people to share this experience with me are not getting traction. Go back and watch Skullduggery and listen to our episode about that one. It is
so ridiculous.
Wild ride.
For sure.
That'll be the first one I listen to that you guys
with Burt Reynolds.
Oh no.
I would say that it's an enjoyable film, but it feels weird to watch. I think the National Treasure. It's like very.
Oh, you're talking about National Treasure, not
Skullduggery.
Yeah, I mean the same applies. It's also a very weird film to watch, but for National Treasure, as a non-American, it feels like just okay, you've got not a lot to work with, but you're kind of shoehorning everything in here. Okay, I mean that's very dismissive and snobbishly old world, I guess, but.
I agree. It's because, not being American, but having so much American knowledge by osmosis, like all this stuff is, all of these words, all these people are floating around in my brain. I don't really know exactly what they did. And like, I'm not invested in it. I don't really care about any of them. It's especially as a prehistoric archaeologist, this is essentially the same time period as today. It's not interesting to me historically. So it's like, the movie, like I said, is really well crafted.
Yeah.
I just can't get into it because I zone out in the action scenes and like all these little historical details. I feel like maybe there's like an American patriotism where you're like, oh yeah, Ben Franklin, and like, oh yeah, Liberty Bell, go Liberty Bell. Like, and like, I don't know why you're so obsessed with this cracked bell. Just get a new bell, right?
Yeah. Well, that's a lot of it. I will say though, as an American, it's the ethos of the founding fathers, which is really blown, in my opinion, out of proportion in terms of like these guys weren't demigods walking among men; they were just educated guys. But I think on a grander scale, the American Revolution is one of the few middle and upper class revolutions in history, in the sense that sometimes we argue that it's not a revolution so much as a reformation. Like it didn't really revolutionize anything. It just took pre-existing English law and English society and tweaked it to be more localized to the American colonies. I think that's a little bit of an oversimplification, but there are more qualified guys with doctorates next to their name who'd argue with me and whatever. But as two people who are not from the United States, I would challenge both of you to simply remember that what is another, and they're out there, I'm sure, but what is another revolution that was waged through open warfare that created a system that did not require a massive like tweaking within 2.5 centuries, which is not to say we do not have problems and we don't have antiquated crap that needs to get gone, because we 150% do. But the French Revolution spawns Napoleon, and the Glorious Revolution in England, you still have a king, you just have a different king. And so, not to downplay the historical significance of those, but I think part of the reason here is we know that we have, special is too generous of a term, we have a historical oddity like on our hands. Like we were formed through something that never seems to work, but we don't know, we learn the wrong lessons from it. We take pride in the parts that we shouldn't. But we do have this basis of like, this is one of the very few times that people revolted and said they were going to build a government, and they did. And part of that is it's a revolt of the educated and not the uneducated. It's a revolt of the haves instead of the have-nots. But it's still a revolt, and it still worked. And so I think like that's just cool. Like historically, anytime somebody says we're going to do this and it doesn't fall apart within a generation is cool. So yeah, think on that, Mr. Across the Pond and Mr. Great White North.
I'm just imagining kind of a kind of stars and stripes in the background and bald eagles flying around.
Thank you. You know what? Don't harass me, Ross. I thought that was an incredibly not jingoistic lecture.
That was very good in the background underneath it.
Yeah, that was very good.
If patriotism in America looked like that rant, it'd be a much healthier version of what we have.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
I'm going to say that the real sin of this movie is that we don't get Nick Cage being Nick Cage. He's pretty straightforward in this movie. He's not screaming about the bees. He's making crazy faces and waving his arms around. I don't know why Nick Cage is in this movie if he's not going to be Nick Cage.
Yeah, he does have Nick Cage hair, though. At various points, I was just distracted by, my God, that hair.
I think this was the beginning of the Nick Cage that we all know and love in terms of his persona, though, because pre-National Treasure, it's The Rock and it's Raising Arizona, and he's acting like he's actually like an actor playing a role. And then National Treasure in post, it's I'm going to steal the Declaration of Independence. Sorry, let me fix my. I can't even get my hairline that receded, but I'm going to steal the Declaration of Independence. Bees. So I think like a lot of actors have that movie that is way more successful than their previous ones, and so they're like, that's just what I'm going to do for the rest of my career. And I think that low key this was that for him, because he's like, oh, this version of me seems to sell a lot of movie tickets.
I don't know. This is after Face Off. Face Off is pretty peak Nick Cage being Nick Cage.
True. Maybe this is a gentrified Nick Cage. This was family friendly Nicolas Cage.
All right, Kyle, where can everybody find you? You host a podcast called History According to Hollywood, where you do a similar thing to what we do here, but with more historical movies rather than prehistoric movies.
Yeah, you can find us on Spotify. We have a YouTube channel. The YouTube channel, though, is HA2H Pod. For reasons I don't know, I did not create the YouTube channel. That would be my better half, my smarter half. I'm just the comedy and the history of our shindig that we do. That we have a lot of shorts on that, though, that have been pretty popular. And so if you need a sampling of what our podcast is like, I encourage you to go on YouTube and watch a short. We're on pretty much all of the formats that you can find a podcast, Apple Music, all that jazz. And yeah, come over sometime, listen to how, despite what Josh just said that made me vomit in my mouth, no, the 1700s are not the same period as today. How dare you, sir?
Everything after 10,000 years is basically the modern period.
Yeah, that's okay. Look, everything before 10,000 years is dinosaurs and troglodytes, my guy. So don't come at me, Mister. Ooh, we found
shots fired. Shots fired.
Look, plane tickets may be pricey, but you're not that far away, Josh. I will come to Canada. So help me. But yeah, it's History According to Hollywood. It's not serialized, so please, for the love of God, do not start on season 1, episode 1. Pick your favorite movie, scroll through what we have. We have something like 24, 25 episodes right now. Wait, no, we have 34 because we did 20 in season 2. Just scroll through, find a movie that you're familiar with, that you've always wondered how historically accurate it is, and start from there. And yeah, we just finished editing the guest episode that Josh was so kind to do with us on 10,000 BC. That one's a ride because that movie's awful. So.
You've covered a few others that we've also covered. I listened to Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure, The Mummy. I don't know if there were more than that, but we definitely covered those ones.
Did you like them? Please lie to me if you listen to the episode.
Yeah, they are great. You know what? You spent a lot less time on the 8 seconds of cavemen in Bill and Ted than we did. I think we spent about 20 minutes on that 8 seconds, and I think you mentioned it in one sentence. So I would look for more cavemen, but apart from that, pretty good.
Hey, look, man, anything before 5,000 BC is all the same. All right. So. But yeah, thank you so much for having me on the podcast. It's been great. History According to Hollywood, please go listen. We're sad and lonely over here in our little Spotify world.
Yeah, thanks for being here. If you've been enjoying Screens of the Stone Age, get in touch with us. Follow us on Twitter at SOTSA_podcast and on Facebook at SOTSA podcast, or send us an email to screensofthestoneage@gmail.com. Screens of the Stone Age is supported by the Paleoanthropological Society of Canada. Find out more at pasc-scpa.ca.